You don't have to believe me, but that waitress just saved your ass. Jack Harris barely glanced up from his phone as he sat in the sleek, dimly lit restaurant. The hum of voices around him faded into a distant murmur as he watched his business partners across the table, completely uninterested in their trivial negotiations. He had built his empire from the ground up, not with charm or charisma, but with sheer force of will. To him, everyone was just another pawn in the game, no one special, especially not the wait staff who flitted around the room like silent shadows. Then came Emma Larson. The waitress, standing just a few feet away, was unremarkable in her black apron and white shirt, carrying a tray of drinks. Jack barely noticed her as she approached, her brown hair pulled back into a neat ponytail, her face an expressionless mask of professionalism. The only thing that caught his eye was the way she moved, graceful, yet with a quiet confidence that suggested she was more than she seemed. "Excuse me," Jack muttered as he set his glass down, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "I need advice. I'm looking to make a move on the market. Got any tips for someone with $1 million to burn?" Emma didn't react the way he expected. She didn't look startled or flustered like the other servers who tried to impress him. Instead, she held his gaze for a long moment, her calm demeanor never wavering. "I don't believe that's on our menu," she replied, her voice steady. Jack snorted, thinking she was joking, but then, to his surprise, she kept talking, offering a detailed explanation about diversifying investments into emerging markets and sustainable energy. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. This was no ordinary waitress. Jack's mind raced. Could she actually know what she was talking about? He had thought it was a joke, a light-hearted comment to amuse himself for a moment. But her answer was precise, almost academic. He set down his drink and leaned forward, the intrigue mounting. "Where did you learn this?" he asked, his tone more serious now. Emma paused, then smiled faintly, her eyes flickering as if weighing how much to reveal. "Just an interest," she said simply, her expression guarded. But Jack wasn't satisfied. His curiosity grew, his mind shifting gears. Who was this woman? How could she, of all people, have such knowledge? As she began to move away, he called out, "Wait!" He was about to ask her more, but something in her steady, unwavering gaze stopped him. She wasn't just a waitress. There was something deeper, something hidden beneath the surface that piqued his interest. He watched her retreat to her next table, her posture poised, moving with the kind of calm authority he usually reserved for himself. Jack couldn't explain it. There was an energy around her that was too strong to ignore. He found himself staring after her, feeling a strange pull. She had caught his attention in a way no one else ever had. That was when he realized she had something that he didn't, something intangible that couldn't be bought with money or power. A few minutes later, when Emma brought the check, Jack's curiosity had turned into respect. He left a tip so large that it could have paid for an entire week's worth of meals for someone else. She looked at the receipt, her face betraying nothing, but he saw the subtle shift in her posture as she gathered the bill. "This is excessive," she said, her voice a quiet mix of disbelief and mild surprise. "Consider it a consulting fee," Jack replied, his voice low but firm. She raised an eyebrow but didn't comment further. Jack rose from the table and paused for a moment, watching her. Emma didn't look back, but he noticed a small, almost imperceptible nod she gave him, acknowledging the unspoken exchange between them. Jack didn't know what had changed, but something inside him had shifted. He left the restaurant, his mind still replaying their brief interaction. Emma Larson had done something no one else could. She had made him rethink everything. Not just about business, but about people, about his own arrogance. It wasn't the size of the tip, or the answer to his investment question that mattered. It was the way she made him feel in that brief moment. He couldn't put it into words, but somehow, everything had changed. And as he stepped out into the crisp evening air, he found himself reflecting on a lesson he never thought he'd learn. Sometimes, the quietest people have the most to say. Jack found himself returning to the same restaurant several times over the next few weeks. His routine hadn't changed, but something about his visits was different. He noticed Emma every time, though she never acknowledged him beyond the typical professionalism expected from a waitress. There was something about her that gnawed at him, pulling at the edges of his thoughts. He couldn't quite figure it out. It was as if she held some secret he wasn't privy to, and that kept him coming back. He never directly sought her out, but she always ended up being the one who served him. She was efficient, quick, and polite, but always distant. No matter how much he observed her, she never revealed any more than the basic surface. He had always been good at reading people, understanding their motives, their fears, their desires, but Emma was different. She was an enigma. One evening, Jack arrived earlier than usual, long before the dinner rush, with a stack of paperwork in hand. He barely noticed the time pass until he heard a voice. "Would you like something to drink while you wait?" Emma stood at his table, a slight smile on her face, her usual professional demeanor still intact. Jack looked up, his gaze meeting hers. For the first time, he saw something beyond her quiet professionalism. There was a flicker of something in her eyes, something that suggested she had more to say, but chose not to. He gestured to the empty chair opposite him. "Take a seat," he said. Emma hesitated, then pulled the chair out and sat down, looking at him as if she had no idea why he had asked. "I've been coming here a lot lately," Jack said, his tone casual, though he could feel the weight of his words. "And I've been thinking. You don't strike me as the typical waitress. You seem like you know more than you let on. And I'm not talking about financial advice." He let the last part hang in the air, knowing full well it would get her attention. Emma's expression didn't change. She kept her gaze steady, but her hands, resting on the edge of the table, betrayed a slight tension. "People like you," Jack continued, "always seem to be hiding something. I wonder what that is." She took a deep breath, her eyes narrowing slightly. For a moment, it seemed as if she would push back, challenge him, but instead, she simply said, "Everyone has a story, Jack. But not everyone needs to share it." Her words hung in the air between them, and Jack found himself momentarily speechless. He hadn't expected such a direct response. He had come into this conversation thinking he would push, that he would learn something, but Emma had turned the tables on him with a single line. Jack leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping lightly on the edge of his glass. "So, you're just going to keep playing this game? Hiding behind a mask?" She smiled, but it wasn't the polite, practiced smile he had seen 1,000 times before. It was different. It was real. "Maybe," she replied. "Maybe some things are meant to stay hidden. Sometimes it's better that way." Jack studied her, the pieces of the puzzle slowly falling into place. There was something more to her, something worth uncovering, but he had learned that people didn't just open up easily, not even for someone like him. He leaned forward again, the challenge in his eyes now clear. "You know, I don't give up easily." She looked at him, and for the briefest of moments, their eyes locked in an understanding that didn't need words. It was a silent agreement between them. Jack realized then that this wasn't just about getting her to open up. It was about something deeper, something that had nothing to do with business or wealth. As Emma stood to leave, she glanced at him over her shoulder. "I'll bring your order when I'm ready," she said, and there was a finality to her words that made Jack pause. This wasn't just a game. This was something far more complicated. Jack sat back, his thoughts swirling. The next time he came here, things would be different. He knew it. Something had shifted. And for the first time in a long time, Jack felt a flicker of anticipation that wasn't tied to a deal or a negotiation. It was tied to her. Jack returned to the restaurant a week later. He had tried to push the memory of Emma out of his mind, but it lingered. He wasn't used to this feeling, the gnawing curiosity, the sense of wanting to know more. As he walked into the familiar space, he scanned the room, his eyes landing on her immediately. She was walking between tables, carrying drinks with a steady grace that suggested a quiet confidence. She looked the same, calm, composed, and distant. But to Jack, something about her was different this time. Maybe it was his own state of mind, or maybe it was the subtle shift in how he was seeing her. He hadn't expected to come back so soon, but somehow, the idea of seeing her again had become irresistible. He settled into his usual corner booth, the same one by the window. His fingers traced the rim of his glass as he waited. When Emma approached with a small smile, Jack noticed how her eyes lingered on him just a moment longer than usual. "What can I get for you today?" she asked, her voice still the same professional tone, but there was a subtle change in the air between them, like a quiet understanding. Jack hesitated, considering his next words carefully. "A glass of red wine, please." "The usual," he said, the words feeling too casual for the weight of the moment. Emma nodded and turned to leave, but this time, Jack felt an urge to speak. "Emma," he called, just loud enough for her to hear. She stopped and looked back, her expression neutral but attentive. "You always seem so distant," Jack said, the words slipping out before he could stop them. "I'm not used to people like you. You know, people who don't care about what others think." Emma's eyes flickered with something, but it was gone before he could interpret it. She didn't answer immediately, but there was a moment of quiet between them, a silence that felt like it held more meaning than either of them could express. "I don't need to care about what others think," she replied finally, her voice still calm, but there was a subtle strength in it that caught Jack off guard. "And I don't need anyone to understand me. That's not my job." She said it without malice, without any of the resistance he expected. Just a simple truth. Jack blinked, taken aback. He had expected her to dismiss his comment, to brush it off with a polite smile, but instead, she had given him something real. He watched her walk away, the faintest smile playing at the corners of his mouth. This wasn't like the usual power games he played with people. She wasn't playing by the rules he understood, and that made him even more interested. Emma returned with his wine a few moments later, her movements as efficient as always, but there was something different in the way she handed him the glass. It wasn't just a transaction anymore. It felt like something unspoken passed between them, something Jack couldn't quite put his finger on. "Thank you," he said, finally breaking the silence that had settled around them. She met his gaze for a brief moment, her eyes steady, and then she turned to leave. But this time, Jack didn't feel the usual pull to follow her with his eyes. Instead, he sat back in his seat, feeling the quiet weight of the moment settle on his shoulders. There was no sudden revelation, no dramatic gesture, just an understanding that had been reached. For the first time in a long time, Jack felt like he was in the presence of someone who wasn't looking for approval, who didn't need to impress anyone. She was just herself. And that, more than anything, was what made her so intriguing to him. Jack had come to realize something in the weeks following his quiet exchanges with Emma. It wasn't just curiosity anymore, it was something deeper. He couldn't deny the feeling that she had become a constant in his mind, a puzzle he was eager to solve but unsure how to approach. Every visit to the restaurant felt like a subtle tug-of-war between his usual confidence and an unfamiliar humility he was learning to accept. One evening, as Jack arrived earlier than usual, he was surprised to find Emma sitting at a table in the corner, looking over some papers. Her posture was relaxed, but there was a focused intensity in her eyes that was impossible to ignore. Jack approached her table, unsure of what had drawn him there. "You're early today," he remarked as he stood before her, his usual cool tones softened by a flicker of curiosity. She looked up, offering him a faint smile. "I thought I'd get some work done before my shift," she replied, her voice still calm, but with a hint of something more, something real. Jack couldn't help but be intrigued. "What kind of work?" he asked, genuinely interested. Emma didn't hesitate. "I'm studying for my certification in financial planning," she said, her eyes meeting his without hesitation. "It's something I've been working on for a while." Jack felt a sudden jolt in his chest. He had known she was intelligent, but this was something different. "Financial planning?" he repeated, almost as if he couldn't believe the words coming from her. She nodded, her fingers lightly tracing the edge of the paper in front of her. "Yes," she said simply, I've been taking night classes for the past year. I want to help people who don't have access to the financial resources they need. My dream is to work for a nonprofit. Jack sat down across from her, his mind spinning. He had assumed Emma's life was just like the others around him, simple, unremarkable. But this was more than he could have imagined. You're serious about this? He said, his voice lower now, more thoughtful. She smiled slightly, a small, almost imperceptible curve of her lips. I'm serious about a lot of things, she replied, her voice steady but with a quiet intensity that seemed to come from deep within her. Jack didn't know what to say. He was used to being in control, to knowing what was going on around him at all times, but Emma? She was an enigma, and for the first time in a long time, Jack wasn't sure where he stood. Why didn't you ever tell me? He asked, unable to hold back the question. She looked at him for a moment, her eyes unreadable. Because it's not anyone's business, she replied softly. And because I didn't want you to see me any differently. I'm just a waitress, Jack. Her words struck him harder than he expected. For all his wealth, all his power, he realized there was something far more valuable about Emma than anything he had ever attained. Jack leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. This wasn't just about finances or work anymore. There was something deeper at play, something that had nothing to do with success or status. It was about connection. Emma's phone buzzed, breaking the moment. She glanced at the screen and stood up. I have to go. I'm due on the floor soon, she said, gathering her papers and standing. Of course, Jack replied, almost too quickly, still processing what she had just shared. As she walked away, Jack couldn't help but feel a strange sense of awe. She wasn't just any woman. She was someone who had built her life on her own terms, someone who had dreams and ambitions that had nothing to do with him. For the first time in a long time, Jack realized he wasn't the one with all the answers. And for the first time, he was okay with that. Jack returned to the restaurant again, this time with a different mindset. He had tried to shake off the thoughts of Emma, but they had stuck with him in a way that he wasn't accustomed to. The sharp, intelligent woman he had met weeks ago had become an unexpected presence in his life, one that lingered in his thoughts even as he navigated his usual routine. He had to see her again. He had to understand her, or at least understand why she had made him feel like this. As he entered the restaurant, he scanned the room quickly, his eyes landing on her immediately. She was at the bar, helping the bartender with a large tray of orders. Her posture was confident, her movements precise. Jack didn't approach her right away. Instead, he sat at his usual table, ordering his drink with a quiet sense of anticipation. He watched her from a distance, noting the way she interacted with the other staff, how they all seemed to respect her with a kind of unspoken familiarity. She wasn't just a waitress. She was something more, someone who had earned her place in this world without flaunting it, without making a spectacle of herself. After a while, Emma came over to take his order. This time, she didn't just ask about his drink. She looked at him, really looked at him, as if she had been waiting for this moment, too. How's your day been? She asked, her tone casual but warm. Jack was taken aback by the question. It was a simple one, but it was also a question he didn't hear often. People didn't care how his day had been. They cared about his business, his money, his status. They didn't care about the man behind the suit. It's been all right, he replied, his voice quieter than usual. Nothing too exciting. And yours? Emma paused for a moment before answering. Busy like always. But I'm used to it. Jack studied her for a moment, his curiosity growing. There was something about the way she spoke, the way she carried herself, that made him feel like there was more going on beneath the surface. She wasn't just a waitress. She wasn't just someone trying to make a living. She had something deeper, something that didn't fit into the neat little boxes that people like him tried to put others in. You know, Jack began, his voice low. You're not like anyone I've ever met. Emma's eyes flickered for a moment, but she didn't look away. I'm not trying to be anyone else, she replied simply. Jack leaned back in his chair, surprised by the honesty in her words. It wasn't like him to feel vulnerable in front of anyone, let alone someone like her, but in that moment, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: respect. "I know," he said, his voice softening. "That's what makes you stand out." Emma smiled slightly, a knowing look in her eyes. She turned to leave, but before she did, she paused. "I'm just doing my job, Jack. Nothing special." Jack watched her walk away, but this time, he didn't feel the same distance between them. There was something in her that had shifted, something in him that had shifted. For the first time, Jack realized that he wasn't the one in control. He wasn't the one with all the answers. And maybe, just maybe, that was okay. Jack hadn't expected to feel this way. He had come to the restaurant so many times now, but each visit felt different. Something in him had shifted the first time he had truly listened to Emma. He had walked in expecting his usual routine, his usual control over the world around him, but this time, everything felt off. It wasn't just her intelligence, or the subtle strength in her silence. It was the way she had looked at him, like she could see right through the polished exterior he had built up over the years. It unsettled him. But it also intrigued him. The next week, Jack found himself back at the restaurant, sitting at his usual table. He had come for the meeting, the usual dinner and business talk, but as he settled in, he realized he was waiting for Emma. She wasn't even supposed to be working that night, but as soon as he saw her step through the door, his heart gave a small, unrecognizable skip. She walked by his table without a glance, delivering drinks to another customer, and Jack found himself watching her more than he intended. He wasn't sure what had happened. Maybe it was the way she moved, or maybe it was the quiet confidence she had, the same confidence that had caught his attention weeks ago. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. That she had become something more than just a waitress to him. He saw her briefly in the kitchen talking to the manager, and then again in the back corner, reviewing some paperwork. She looked so different from the people he usually interacted with, so focused, so real. He couldn't stop thinking about the way she carried herself, about how she seemed completely unconcerned with how others saw her. For a moment, Jack considered getting up, walking over to her, and striking up a conversation, but something held him back. It wasn't that he was nervous, not exactly. He had always been able to control every situation. But with her, it was different. He didn't know how to break through her calm reserve. As if sensing his gaze, Emma turned and walked toward him. "I didn't think I'd see you here tonight," she said, her voice soft but steady. "I wasn't expecting to be here either," Jack replied, his voice almost too quiet. He was surprised by how natural the conversation felt. "It's been a long week." She nodded. "I can imagine." There was a slight pause, a moment where neither of them spoke. Jack looked at her, really looked at her this time. Her eyes were steady, almost challenging, as if she knew what he was thinking. "You know, I've been thinking a lot about our last conversation," he said, his words coming out more serious than he intended. "I didn't realize how much you were keeping to yourself. There's more to you than meets the eye, Emma." Emma's gaze softened for a moment, but she quickly masked it. "People like to think they can figure others out, but they can't." "Not really." Jack leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He didn't know why, but he felt like he had just cracked open a door that he hadn't even known existed. He had always prided himself on knowing everything, controlling everything, but with her? He had no answers, no strategies. He just had questions. "I'm starting to think that's exactly the point," Jack said quietly. "Maybe I'm tired of trying to figure everything out." Emma smiled faintly, her eyes lingering on his face for a moment longer than usual. "Then maybe you're learning something new," she said softly. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between them in that moment. There was no grand gesture, no big confession, just the quiet realization that they had both stepped into unfamiliar territory. Emma's phone buzzed in her pocket, breaking the moment. She glanced down at it before looking back at him. "I have to go," she said, her voice still calm but carrying a finality that Jack couldn't ignore. Of course, Jack replied, but he didn't stand. He watched her walk away, and for the first time, he didn't feel the need to chase her. He didn't need to control everything. He had just learned something about himself. And it was more than he ever expected to find in a place like this. Jack returned to the restaurant again, this time with a feeling he couldn't quite name. He had come to expect the usual routine, meetings, deals, and the same people, and yet Emma had made him question his own patterns. It wasn't just her intelligence that intrigued him anymore, nor was it her quiet strength. It was the way she made him feel like the world didn't revolve around him for once. He stepped into the restaurant, his eyes automatically searching for her. He didn't know why, but it had become a habit now. When he saw her, he wasn't sure what he expected. She was still the same Emma, moving with a quiet efficiency, taking orders and delivering drinks, always a professional, always distant. But this time, something felt different. He wasn't sure if it was the way she had looked at him the last time they spoke, or the fact that he was beginning to see her differently. She was more than just a waitress. She was someone with her own story, her own life, and it was becoming clear to him that he had no idea what that story was. He waited for her to approach his table, watching as she moved between customers. He noticed how everyone seemed to know her, how there was a quiet respect in the way they spoke to her. She wasn't just someone who took orders and served food, she was someone people trusted. And Jack found himself wondering why that was. When she finally reached his table, she seemed a little different, too. There was something in her expression that wasn't there before. Maybe it was the fact that she had spent weeks unknowingly occupying his thoughts. Or maybe it was the realization that he hadn't been as in control of everything as he thought. "What can I get you today?" she asked, her voice still steady, but this time there was something more to it, an unspoken challenge, as if she had already figured him out in ways he wasn't ready to admit. Jack cleared his throat, feeling the familiar tension that came when he didn't know what to expect. "I'll have the usual," he said, the words slipping out without much thought. But then he paused, his gaze meeting hers. "Actually, how about you? What would you recommend?" Emma raised an eyebrow slightly, surprised by the question. "You're asking me for advice?" she said, a hint of amusement in her voice. Jack smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Maybe I'm just trying to understand you a little better," he said quietly. There was a moment of silence between them, and for the first time, Jack realized how rare it was for him to admit that. Emma's eyes softened just slightly, but she didn't respond right away. Instead, she picked up his menu and glanced over it. "I think you'll like the risotto," she said after a beat. "It's the best we have." Jack nodded, the silence lingering for a moment longer than he was used to. He could feel his own walls starting to crumble, just a little. "All right," he said, feeling more vulnerable than he cared to admit. "I'll trust you." As she turned to leave, Jack watched her go, the small smile she gave him almost imperceptible. There was something in that smile, something that spoke to him more than any words ever could. She didn't need to explain herself. She didn't need to impress him. And somehow, that made her even more compelling. Jack sat back in his chair, his mind racing. He had come here expecting to just pass the time, to complete another business dinner. But instead, he found himself in the midst of a quiet revolution inside his own mind. Emma wasn't just another person he could figure out and control. She was something different. And for the first time in a long time, Jack wasn't sure if he wanted to control it. Maybe it was time to stop trying so hard to figure everything out. Maybe it was time to just let things be. The following week, Jack sat at his usual table, waiting for his meal to arrive. He wasn't expecting much today, just another night, another meeting, but his mind kept wandering back to Emma. She had been on his mind more than he cared to admit. Every interaction, no matter how brief, seemed to carry a weight that lingered far longer than any business deal ever could. He found himself observing her more closely than usual, noticing the way she moved, how she spoke, the quiet confidence that radiated from her even in the busiest of moments. And today, he couldn't ignore the feeling that something had shifted between them. Emma walked over to his table, her footsteps light but purposeful. As she approached, she looked at him for a moment longer than usual, as if weighing something. "How's everything today?" she asked, her tone still polite but with a soft edge, as though she was genuinely asking, not just going through the motions. Jack looked up at her, meeting her gaze. For a moment he felt like the world had slowed down. She wasn't just a waitress to him anymore. She had become something far more complex, something he wasn't entirely sure how to navigate. "It's good," Jack said, his voice quieter than usual. "I've been thinking about our last conversation." Emma's brow furrowed slightly, and she gave a small nod. "You've been thinking about me?" she asked, the faintest hint of amusement in her voice. Jack paused. He wasn't used to being caught off guard, but her question felt different. It wasn't just casual small talk. It felt real. "Not in the way you might think," he replied, his voice almost soft. "I've just been thinking about how you see the world." Emma didn't speak right away. Instead, she leaned against the table for a moment, considering his words. Her eyes, steady and calm, held his gaze. "What do you think you've learned?" she asked. Jack leaned back in his chair, his hands clasped in front of him. He had never been one to share much about himself, but something about Emma made him feel like he could. "I think I've learned that maybe I've been so focused on control, on keeping everything in my hands, that I forgot what it feels like to let go." Emma's expression softened, but she said nothing for a moment. Instead, she gave him a small, knowing smile. "Letting go isn't always easy," she said, almost as if she were speaking from experience. Jack studied her, trying to understand the deeper meaning behind her words. She wasn't just talking about control in the literal sense. There was something more personal there, something about vulnerability. "No," he said slowly. "It's not. But it's also not the end of the world, is it?" Emma's smile widened slightly, and she stood up straight, her professionalism returning. "I'll get your meal ready," she said, her tone shifting back to its usual calm efficiency. But this time, Jack noticed a small shift in the way she moved. It was as if something had passed between them, unspoken yet understood. As she walked away, Jack felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of peace, a sense of something deeper that he couldn't yet grasp but was beginning to understand. For the first time, he wasn't trying to control everything. He was letting things unfold, letting them happen. And for once, he didn't feel the need to force it. Emma returned with his meal a few minutes later, and as she placed it in front of him, their eyes met once more. She didn't say anything, but Jack knew that the moment had shifted. Something had changed, and for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel like a loss. It felt like freedom. The restaurant was quieter that evening, the kind of peaceful stillness that only arrived once the rush had passed, leaving behind only the hum of the lights and the soft clink of silverware being cleaned. Jack sat at his usual table, but it felt different now. He wasn't here to seal a deal or discuss numbers. He was here because he simply wanted to be, just for the sake of it. He wasn't expecting anything to change, not really. But he could feel the subtle shift, the way his own thoughts seemed to slow down when he let them. Emma came by, her footsteps light but purposeful as always, and for the first time, Jack noticed the small things. The way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the soft curve of her smile as she glanced at him, the quiet confidence in her every movement. She wasn't rushing, wasn't distracted, just fully present in this moment. "Evening," she said, her voice still calm, but there was something warmer in it today, something less guarded. Jack looked up, meeting her eyes with an openness that had taken him weeks to allow. "Evening," he replied, his voice softer than usual, the usual tension between them gone. There was a long moment of silence. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was just still. "Would you like the usual?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. Jack smiled, feeling the corners of his mouth lift in a way that was no longer forced. "Yeah, I think I'll go with that," he said. Emma nodded and began to walk away, but then stopped. She glanced back at him, her eyes lingering a little longer than before. Jack didn't know why, but in that moment, he felt like something had clicked into place. She wasn't waiting for him to say something, wasn't looking for an answer. It was just a moment, a quiet exchange, like two people who had spent enough time together to understand without words. As she turned to leave, Jack caught himself smiling, but it wasn't a smile born from amusement or politeness. It was something deeper, a quiet recognition of how far they had come without even realizing it. Jack leaned back in his chair, his gaze following her as she walked away. The night felt different now. More meaningful, somehow. He didn't need to rush or control anything anymore. Not with her. Not with this. The space between them felt full, not with tension, but with possibility. It wasn't about figuring it all out, not anymore. It was about being okay with not having all the answers. And for the first time in a long time, Jack was at peace with that. Emma returned with his meal a few moments later, and as she placed it in front of him, their eyes met again. There was no grand gesture, no dramatic change. But there was something in that brief exchange, something unspoken, that made everything feel right. Emma smiled slightly, the same small, quiet smile that had become so familiar to him. Jack smiled back, a simple movement, but it carried with it everything that had shifted between them. She didn't need to say anything, and neither did he. In that moment, it wasn't about fixing anything or making it perfect. It was just about being there, together, and that was enough. Thanks, Jack said softly, his voice steady but filled with a quiet appreciation. Emma nodded, her expression serene. And as she walked away, Jack felt the weight of the silence that followed, not as something empty, but as something full. Full of everything that didn't need to be said. Sometimes, the most important things are the ones left unspoken,